All right. Hello, guys. Welcome to our, Media Buying Summit Live. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm just gonna, take you through a few key housekeeping points before we get started. First of all, again, thank you for being here. And thank you to our partners. If you look at this slide, you can see a bit of who those are. Thank you to them. And then let's also take a quick look at who's here. We've also got another slide of who's here. That's coming up now. Okay, so, if you haven't been to a Digiday event, a virtual Digiday event before, you might not know that we have been able to, continue the networking opportunities for you guys via Airtable. If you see that link right there, if you click that, you put in the password, you create a profile, you can still network with a few of the attendees here. Obviously, it's hard to replicate being in person at a bar, but if you can chat with someone, that's pretty cool. Okay, so to ask questions today via Zoom, you're going to go to the bottom and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And then, if you have a question of one of the panelists, put the question there and I'll try and get to it. So please participate. We love participation, love to facilitate your questions. Okay, so first up, I'm just going to go through a few key trends of what is happening in the marketplace. One thing that I've heard about from marketing leaders is that, they need to keep a contingency plan in place. And while it's not new for marketers to have to, have a backup plan, know that there's a possibility that whatever is planned is not necessarily, going to work out perfectly. Having contingency plans for multiple crises is new. So, if you ask marketers how their jobs have changed, you'll hear about them, needing all of these different backup plans. I was speaking to someone last week who said 2020 has been the year of contingency plans. So, having to plan for different scenarios, as mentioned, isn't new, but of course the breadth of various scenario planning is. And being able to implement those plans on a dime is also new and difficult. Now, obviously that's having an impact not only on media planning, but also on creative. I know I was speaking to a few people about how, Halloween and Thanksgiving, figuring out what that will look like this year and putting that, out in new ads is something that a lot of marketers are trying to figure out how to do right now. Okay, so another key trend, obviously, is that we are dealing with a more tumultuous social media landscape than normal. Even just yesterday, we heard about a new Facebook boycott. It's this one-day timeout from celebrities like Kim Kardashian and Mark Ruffalo. It's part of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign that brands took part in back in July, with Unilever and Ben & Jerry's pulling ad dollars from the platform. While that didn't really seem to make much of a dent in Facebook's bottom line, as most of you guys know, much of their ad revenue comes from small businesses. The push for Facebook to do better continues, but Facebook isn't the only social media platform, and we have seen, TikTok dealing with Trump's executive order to sell off its US business. That's made for a tricky time for the platform. Earlier this week, we heard news of a partnership with Oracle, but it's still unclear what that will, if that will satisfy the executive order. Yesterday, I surveyed a bunch of different media buyers, sort of hoping to put together a piece of like, all right, so what does this mean? Like, is this settled? Are we going to be able to, really move on from this strange time for TikTok? And most of what I heard was, Well, TBD. We don't know. We'll see. Maybe it'll be okay. Maybe it won't. So, TikTok and Facebook are dealing with a really strange time. Media buyers are having to manage that. And then you add into that the like normal insanity of Q4, where CPMs get to be pretty wild. And you've got a more tumultuous social media landscape than normal. Another thing that's changed, if you've been following, I mean, the upfronts have felt like they've gone on forever and tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. But there's been a bit more flexibility for advertisers in TV deals. In those upfront negotiations, networks have allowed advertisers to get out of deals if they see that streaming's viewership is going to cannibalize traditional TV ratings, as Tim Peterson reported. So that's one thing that's changed there. We'll see if that flexibility continues. TBD. Another, change in the landscape has been that retail media is just continuing to rise. That's been going on for a few years, with Target and Walmart really bolstering their offerings. But now with people staying at home and shopping via e-commerce, marketers have been more interested in retail media channels, because if someone's, buying a bunch of junk on Walmart.com, not that everyone's buying junk, but just if they're buying a bunch of stuff, you want to be able to get their attention. So retailers have been looking to cash in on that, and you're seeing new retailers like CVS get in on that. So those have been some of the key trends that we've seen in the market. Next up, I'm going to moderate a session with Allison Schultz. She's the SVP of Product at Dentsu. We're going to talk about brand safety and the news. I would like to bring Allison up to the stage.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay, obviously, news, it's been wild. It's a wild time. Maybe we should start out by talking about how in the spring we heard from a bunch of publishers who were really frustrated by coronavirus being on a keyword blocking list. Block list, and they were adding that to their block lists en masse. It seemed like much of the strategy for buyers that buyers were putting in place was to avoid anything associated with the coronavirus, at least at the beginning of the pandemic. How has that strategy evolved in the months since then?
Yeah, no, great question. I think this year has really pushed the issue on keyword blocking and its effects, but this has been an issue for long before coronavirus. I think from a buy side, the main tool that exists when a buyer has concerns about news is using keyword blocking, or has been keyword blocking. And the truth is, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So this is something that's been near and dear to my heart. And the way we've tackled that at Dentsu is truly by looking at how can we expand the portfolio of options that we give a buyer who has concerns about news. So creating essentially the marketplace of brand safe, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later, quality inventory. How can we get more signals within quality news, and then work with the big brand safety providers so that we're continuing to use what I think someone at DV referred to as the minimum effective dose of keyword blocking. We've done a ton of research on this as well, just consumer research around the importance of news. And I think the goal from an advertising perspective is we've seen the research that just shows that our consumers treat news as so vital, this year more than ever? And then how do we assign that same importance from a buying perspective in a brand safe and suitable way?
Sure. I guess I would just love to hear a bit more about, are buyers still blocking on that same level that they were, say, in March, or have you been able to reel that back a little bit?
We've definitely been able to reel that back. It's I can't speak for every buyer everywhere, but the strategy of diversification of how one addresses content has been pretty effective.
Got it. Okay. We've heard the conversation with marketers is shifting from talk of brand safety to brand suitability. Why is that?
Yeah, this is really something that's been led by the 4As, and they've done a lot of good work on this. And it's really to define brand safety as like clear cut, terrible things like illegal content, fraud, like stuff that no one shouldn't exist in the ecosystem. It does. So you got to have some strong tools in place to avoid it. Whereas suitability is more of the judgment call, and those are my words, not the 4As. But the way I think about it is, does this content align with the brand goals? There's nothing in news that's ever not brand safe. Suitability is the thing that's the judgment call, and that's where we want to take a more kind of scalpel rather than a hammer. I'm big on the tool metaphors today. Specific approach to how you're doing it, which is why we go, have structured what we're doing internally as those layers of where are you running, what tools can you put on top of it, and then how do you use the brand safety layers.
Yeah, I mean, how does that change the strategy when it comes to the news, especially when much of the news can be labeled bad news? Because, what we hear about often is like fear of the screenshot. Everyone's afraid of their brand being next to something, terrible. It's like, and I understand it. You don't necessarily want, to be pitching some deal when there's this number of coronavirus deaths, but we're in a moment where there's a lot of news. A lot of it is perceived as bad. And, how do you manage that and still support news organizations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's important to kind of notice that when people have concerns about running in news, it's not just the question of bad news. Like we kind of kicked off this project internally at the beginning of the year, talking to a bunch of our buyers to say, okay, like obviously nobody sits down at their desk and thinks like, okay, how am I going to defund the news today? It's not, that's no one's goal on the marketer side. That's no one's goal on the advertiser side. So then what are the reasons that we do end up avoiding news in places that we do it? And there were three big themes that came back in that conversation. The first theme was around obviously not wanting to support disinformation online, especially. The second one was concern about being around polarizing content. And then the third is worry about negative or unpredictable news. And, the way that we approach this at Dentsu is, okay, let's lean into those concerns and figure out how you can set up the playground, the targeting, so that, if someone has concerns about all three, great, there's things we can do on all three. But if it's really just one or two of those, get a little bit more specific.
How so? What do you actually do? Like, give me an example of what you would do with a publisher to do that.
Yeah, good question. So like to the point about someone who's concerned around disinformation, the thing that we do there is we essentially just have a marketplace that we've built in partnership with a lot of both trade organizations, associations, publishers to kind of define what quality news is. So for someone who's concerned about disinformation, okay, we can get you into this playground, and this is where you'll be running in a not disinformation area. For clients that have had concern around polarizing content, one of the things that we've done is look at the difference between kind of objective reported content from kind of straight down the middle publishers with more opinion stuff. So starting to talk to or working with publishers on how we can pick up the flags to differentiate between opinion versus like objective reporting, this is what happened today content, and making that difference clear to our advertisers and in how we target campaigns.
Opinion is difficult, definitely. You know, even in news literacy, you hear where people like don't understand when something is an opinion piece versus a news piece. It's a tricky market. So when we spoke previously during the prep call, you mentioned that Dentsu advocates for marketers to continue to advertise with publishers. Is that sort of how you do that, you know, with what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly. Like using the approach of let's have a more specific conversation about what the concerns around news are. We also have do news audits to kind of understand what a client's current footprint into news looks like now, and what the benefits are of that news media that's occurred in the past, and then come together with the strategies of what tactics can we use to lean into news more specifically.
Sure.
And one piece that's been interesting as we start to look at like how our ad tech can better help us here. I'm a product person by background. I just have a strong interest in news and what we can do. So I tend to think of things from a technology standpoint. You know, as we move to the end of the third-party cookie, there is a lot more opportunity in terms of assigning contextual relevancy and scoring, you know, to better kind of swing the pendulum back to not just say, hey, I want to target this person wherever they are, but I want to target this person wherever they are. I want to target this person, but I also want to fit these 5 criterias in terms of being on professionally produced content, someone with a byline, in reported as opposed to opinion type of work.
Yeah, and what has the response been from marketers when you push the return of contextual? Because contextual for some time, like years ago, it was about context, and then it was about let's get everyone everywhere, and now it seems like this return of context.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's the pendulum kind of swings. Like, you know, 50 years ago, there was no person-based targeting. Now we're to a place where we have options of, you know, user targeting and contextual targeting. And I think that the overlap of the two if done correctly, can be really interesting. If done incorrectly, then you're trying to target the left-handed tennis players on the, you know, 2 local newspapers in Cleveland, and you don't have any scale. But when you can, in a single media program, both layer in the context with the addressability and the person base, I think that's kind of the sweet spot of where things are going to.
Got it. One thing that I find kind of interesting just on this context point is that it seems like context matters when you're talking about a news publication, but there isn't as much of a conversation about context with social media channels. And I do wonder if we'll push that conversation at any point a little forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And we've spent a bit of time looking at that. You know, the obvious difference between the news publications and social media is like the professional news pubs are liable for the content that they create. So brand suitability in a news environment looks really different than it does in social media. If you've got an article about if you have an article, I'm trying to think of what the appropriate example is, if you've got an article on the Wall Street Journal about ISIS, like, it's not going to be something that is recruiting people into doing it. That's mostly cut out of all the social networks as well at this point, but there's a difference in terms of the fact that the news publications are liable for what they're producing. That gives a different level of safety.
Right. Okay. Obviously coronavirus isn't the only change in the landscape we've seen in recent months. With Black Lives Matter protests, there's been a push to make advertising more inclusive. Advertising certainly has a lot of issues when it comes to being inclusive and actually being diverse. There was this change in the nomenclature of inclusion and exclusion lists instead of black and white lists. Can you tell us a bit about that and what that conversation has been like with buyers?
Yeah, first of all, like, words matter. Like, we're in advertising, we know this. Inclusion and exclusion, which is how we talk about those lists now, is both more precise, and it doesn't have any loaded terms to it. I think the whole industry has made this change, and it's pretty literally like the very least we could do. So I haven't heard a moment of even conversation with either publishers or advertisers about it. Just like, oh, obviously, like, make this change.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so, we started this conversation by talking about how publishers have been sort of frustrated. They were creating all this content, all of these articles about what's happening with the coronavirus, but, a lot of that content ended up on block lists, and it's hard to monetize. Is there something that publishers should be doing to work with media buyers to make it easier to monetize their content even when there's bad news? With the election and the pandemic and the economy as it is, I don't think we're going to entirely ease up on quote unquote bad news for some time.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's not, at least from my purposes, like, if there is bad news, it should be reported and funded. Like, we wouldn't want news organizations just to be talking about, hearts and sunshine either. For what would help me on this is really where we can pick up that news specific taxonomy and signals to further understand into news. Yes, there's the way you can cut news. Is it good news? Is it bad news? But there's a lot of other ways to cut it as well. So, like, to the opinion versus reporting content, to the quality signals, like, was this article written by someone on staff, or is this an ad showing up next to the comment section? I think most pubs don't do a comment section, but just having that kind of guarantee either built in or made very clear in what signals we get from the news organizations is a really helpful way of saying, like, hey, there's more to this than is it good or is it bad. I think there's like a utility, there's a quality piece to it, and then there's just the what's the benefit of the adjacency to the masthead as opposed to the adjacency to the page content.
Mm-hmm. What do you think buyers could be doing to make it a little easier for publishers?
I think the key, I don't have a silver bullet on that, but I think the key would be transparency on what settings and approaches are throughout the chain. Like, I love the approach of using minimum effective dose from a keyword block perspective, but then keeping that really transparent so that everyone throughout the chain knows, hey, this particular publisher or this particular advertiser does not want to be running, say, in politics, so that there aren't any wasted impressions then that go into politics or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what do you think the next couple of weeks will look like? I mean, we're about to have a lot more political coverage. Do you think there's going to be a lot of marketers pulling out for a few weeks, or what do you see happening?
That's a good question. I'm frankly not close enough to know of publishers that are or advertisers that are like wholesale changing strategy. I
Mm-hmm.
haven't heard about any of that. I think you know, there's always going to be concern around partisan. And then to me, it's a question of then how do you parse, hey, is this article of itself partisan, or is this talking about something like horse race in an election, and making clear the difference between the two. Either this is an article that has a specific point of view on a specific side, which is good, that exists, but then just being aware the difference between that and then like the objective reporting of there was a poll, it says this, here's what's happening next type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Sure, that makes sense. If anyone has a question for Allison, remember you can use the Q&A function below and I will ask her that question. I just want to highlight that again. If you wanted to chat about brand safety in the news. Okay, so, obviously we've kind of gone over the landscape as it is at this moment. I guess I just wonder, we are, going to be, I don't know, like we're going to be dealing with this moment of, our country is more divided. It has been for some time. This idea of partisanship in the news, it does seem like it's dicier and dicier. I guess I just wonder, like, does that get more difficult to manage on the marketer side of it or the media buyer side of it at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what you're talking about, just if I can like say it back to you, is like where whole outlets get assigned to be partisan.
Yeah, I think there's just like how we talk about news organizations has shifted. People always had opinions about like CNN or, MSNBC or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. People have opinions about where those publications line up. Those already existed, but those have been exacerbated by this political landscape. And it just seems as though it might be, I don't know, it might be even harder to try and appear as though you're not taking a position on either side. Like if you're on CNN and one party is saying that CNN is this kind of organization, then what does that do for the buyer and advertiser in those positions? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a silver bullet on that, but for me, it comes back to the objectivity point of, whether you're news organization X or on this side of the spectrum, news organization Y on that side of the spectrum. When your job is to report the facts and then you have an output that is a video or an article that is, hey, look, here's what's going on in the world. It shouldn't matter. And the primary thing should be, hey, look, this is accurate information that is being shared. And that is the value created. I think that, online, and especially in the current environment, there's sometimes a push of like, oh, you should have more of an identity as an organization. And that identity obviously has opinions and points of view in it. And that's kind of why I keep coming back to this point about like, yes, that's all good to have the identity and the points of view. And there's some people who are going to advertisers that are going to buy because of that identity, and there's some advertisers that are going to avoid because of that identity. But then there's also the other side of it, that is the almost like a public utility of, here's what's happening in your state house, here's what's happening in the Capitol, here's what's happening in the streets, that it is not is not part of the, hey, we're going to have a flashy identity side of things, but just saying what's happening. And I think kind of calling out the difference between the almost like the public utility side and the branding side is a helpful way, at least for me, to think about that divide.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have an audience question. One of our audience member was wondering, what about professional sports? If your brand wants sports, but not the political social agenda, and it's impossible currently to avoid. They say a few of their reps are brands simply backing out and trying to reach those audiences elsewhere.
You mean are people still like running in sports, and do people consider sports news? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think it's that the question of partisanship or politics has come into sports and the way that sports are covered, and even sports websites. I think if you remember a few months ago, I don't know what is time anymore. Maybe it was longer than that, but the Deadspin, the site that covered sports, there was a push from the company that owned Dead Sports to be like, okay, you guys got to just stick to sports, and this sticks to sports coverage. I think it's something that affects not only who is writing about sports, but also when pro athletes are making statements on the field, then it's harder to avoid, I guess.
Right. It's an interesting question, because I would have told you 6 months ago that sports, I've never heard of anyone having any questions about writing in sports content. That's has always seemed to me very high in demand, not controversial in any way. Personally, I love that sports, it looks more like news now, in terms of there are things outside the game that are happening there as just a place where there's a lot of attention, and the players understand that they have that attention. I don't know enough about any of our sports targeting programs to know if anything has shifted as a result of that. I still tend to see sports and news or sports as kind of a bubble within news, but it's interesting how it's tending to overlap in and out more.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. Okay, we have another audience question. As far as brand safety and measuring it consistently across a campaign, we've used Adobe for larger campaigns. However, do you recommend measuring brand safety for smaller clients that don't have the budget for an Adobe type solution?
It's a good question. I think it would depend on how you're handling your targeting. If you're simply contracting with major large publishers, might not be necessary. But for running it, I guess to the upstream downstream side of things, I'm personally an advocate of take care of all of your targeting in a clean and safe manner upstream, so that then downstream is a kind of trust but verify. You've put everything in place, and then you just have that last check to make sure that you're getting what you think you're getting. And that's my general approach on that. If you don't have the budget to do that last check, then make sure your upstream stuff is really solid in terms of the partners you're working with, being specific if it's in programmatic about the domains that you're running against, not to get super tactical, but like in a I think there's been a big shift in programmatic, which is again my background, where it used to be that one would come up with an exclude list of all of the places that said, we know we don't want to be here, but everything else is fine. I think that very fortunately the trend and the momentum is now to, okay, let's have the include list of the, thousands of sites, that hundreds of sites, whatever it is that we think are valid and we've checked in a couple of different ways, and then nothing outside of that is I think a pretty important shift in terms of the upstream implementations.
Could you tell us a bit more about that shift to, instead of exclusion, inclusion? I mean, obviously, if you're focused on exclusion, you're just going to be thinking about the sites. You're like, okay, well, that one's bad, I don't want to be there. Right. But you could still end up on a bad site that you don't know about. Is that kind of, the big...
Yeah, and for better or worse, the internet's a really big place, and new sites pop up every day. Mm-hmm. And it's new good sites and new bad sites. And, from a preventing fraud perspective, honestly, running on a list that is hey, here's a known trusted partners list, is a stronger way than saying, hey, here's what I don't know. Like, the internet's too big to say, I know this part of it is bad, everything else is okay. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. Yeah. And we've found in transitioning ourselves from moving from an exclusion to an inclusion approach, as long as you keep an eye on what the largest sites are, and where we've seen historical successes and strengths, that we can really lean into those partnerships.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like the fraudsters, at the very least, understand that needing like a legit byline and like seeming like a, legit news source is important. Like, there's a woman who used to work for Ad Age, and I think she's at CNBC now, Meg Graham. She was tweeting about how her pieces keep ending up on like fake ABC sites, and it's like, oh, okay, like people have clearly picked up on that. They like need a byline, they need it to look legit to be able to sort of siphon this revenue. And it seems like the market, even amid all of this insanity, has just gotten even more difficult. So I guess the switch to inclusion versus exclusion is really important.
Yeah, and I mean that switch also requires kind of being abreast of the market and knowing what the real new entrants are in terms of quality publications that you don't want to be excluding. New entrants, and then also like, what are the smaller sites that are perfectly good but you need to be there? I've spent a lot of time looking at that. The Local News Consortium did a great job kind of compiling an inclusion list of all of the sites in their member networks, kind of to say, hey, look, we understand that people are making this shift. Don't forget about local news in this. Mm-hmm. So that's been a really helpful asset that we've used.
Yeah. If only local news could still like figure out how to make the experience not terrible. But I try and read my local paper, and it's full of buggy, terrible ads. And that still seems to be something we haven't solved with local news. People want to read it.
Yeah, but then when you cram too many ads exactly on a page, then you get yourself into a downward cycle on that. It's important that not every local news site follows that pattern, but there are way too many of them.
Yeah. Is that something you guys talk about with local news organizations at all, of just like, okay, you know, let's try and make this look a bit more legit by you know, getting rid of some of this overload? Or are they just so desperate for revenue?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, in terms of the partners that we talk to on this, we've definitely raised the concern about like, okay, just having the clean, clear layout, the fewer ads on a page. It's also something that we monitor pretty closely in terms of like where the ad placements are on the page. So we've actually can sort into, you know, those thousands of local news sites, which are the ones that have kind of fewer ad units, generally higher viewability scores, and from the ones with the lower scores. So it's something that we pay attention to for sure.
Got it. Unless any of our audience members have another question for Allison, I'm going to give you 1 second in case you want to furiously type it in. I think that should probably wrap up our session here today. I'm going to look, see if there are any. Doesn't seem like it. Okay. Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you for being here today. Really appreciate your point of view and your time.
Yeah,
really
absolutely. Great. Love speaking with you. Thanks so much, Christina.
You too.
Talk to you later.
Bye. Okay, so next up, you are going to hear a conversation between Aditya Padai. She is the Director of Business Development at IO. It'll be moderated by James O'Brien. He's the head of production for custom here at Digiday. I'm gonna turn it to you, James.
Thank you so much, Christina, and we're very happy to have Aditya here with us. Please welcome him, and we are on the cusp, aren't we, of Q4 and a year of absolute change. It's infused our lives with all kinds of new experiences online, and that outcome also means a lot more people online, a surge of people across virtually every online channel and environment that we can think of, and now digital ad spend will be responding to that transformation. It's slowed a bit in the last quarter or two, but it's expected to surge again next year. Maybe 26% growth is what some analysts have been saying. And so what's the same? What we'll talk about with you, Aditya, today is that there are still challenges in reaching all those eyes and ears. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, really the root of a person's decision-making process online. What kind of experience are they having? I mean, that's at the root of it. And Aditya, you spend a lot of time at IO thinking about these things. So let's start there. What are some key categories that you and your teams assess around consumer behaviors towards ads, and what are the big buckets into which those behaviors fall?
Cool. Yeah, thanks, James. Nice to be speaking with you, and hello, everyone. Before answering that question, I think I would like to spend a minute or so talking a little bit about IO and what we do, add a little bit more context to that, those user groups. So in general, IO has been around since 2011, and the mission of the company has, since right from the start, has been to find the right experience between right balance between user experience and online advertising. So we build softwares that help users gain control of their browsing experience. And since we've been doing this for the past almost a decade, I think we are able to put consumers in three main buckets. And so the first one is non-addressable users for marketers. And these are users that are like hardcore ad blockers, or these are users that are willing to pay for content in order to avoid ads. What is common about these users is like they are very sensitive, and in fact, it is best that you don't show ads to these users. If you're more likely to harm your brand image if you show ads to these users. Then there is the second group of users, which is standard ad users, and over there for these consumers, there's a lot of scope for experimenting. these users are not that sensitive, and you can show them various different kinds of ads and see what works well for you and what doesn't. And then there is this special third group of users, third group of consumers. The way we call it is ad format filtering consumers. And it's a big group. It's a group of 200 million users globally. And these users these users choose a certain kind of web experience, which means they are addressable. You can reach them reach them. You can deliver your message to them online. Uh, at the same time, they are conscious about their browsing experience. So they are okay with ads as long as they are light and they don't disrupt their browsing experience. So these are the three buckets that I would put consumers into.
Right. I think that we often think a lot about maybe those first two buckets and maybe not as much or as often about that more nuanced category. And let's put a pin in that for a moment. My suspicion is that we have a bit of housekeeping to do still around the idea of all three categories. And so I'm wondering that within any of those categories, what are you and your teams at IO seeing still happen around tactics or approaches to them that generally lead to what I would say would be the most wasted spend for advertisers? What are the moves that you would flag or say are key to getting that unhappy result in any of those categories? What's not working?
That's a very good question. And like you said, yeah, I mean, there is a lot of scope on optimizing this ad spends in all three categories, right? Some of the most common things that we as an industry have been talking for a long time, uh, for example, is ad fraud. There's a lot of money that is wasted in the industry on this. Uh, there is ad tech taxes, something that we've started talking about pretty recently. And I mean, there have been researchers out there that out of every dollar spent, 30 cents reach a publisher, and a huge amount of money is going into middlemen's pockets. Uh, we have been talking about wastage on non-viewable inventory, where ads are not just seen at all. But from my perspective, there is this whole concept that we know, but which is called as banner blindness, which where a lot of money is being wasted, in my opinion. And at the same time, this is like the least addressed problem at the moment. Uh, so the first one is definitely we spend a lot of money on banner blind users. And then the second one I would say is a lost opportunity. There is an opportunity to show your message, to deliver your message to a group of users that are willing to receive it that in a certain way. So they are filtering out formats, but you can still reach out to them. So that's the second one, the wasted opportunity. And yeah, like a wise man once said, uh, nothing is more expensive like a wasted opportunity.
I think the opportunity here is to think about that third. I mean, I want to go back to the third category that you suggested have a more nuanced or complicated approach to ads. I mean, short of rewiring the human brain, banner blindness is what it is, right? I mean, it's a behavioral outcome of frequency and perhaps content, working in ways that we wish that they wouldn't wouldn't as often. But when we think about that sort of sensitive group, the third bucket, I would call them maybe ad aware. They're making some choices about what they're aware of what they want from their ads. Who are they, and what are they actually doing differently than other categories like the standard or the hardcore audience cohorts that we've talked about?
Right. Another good question, James. So before we go over there, I think I do want to highlight a few things about these banner blind users, right? That would help us understand how we can solve the problem of banner blindness, in my opinion. So, I mean, these users firstly exist everywhere, and it's not rocket science. But still, if you go back to early mid 90s when the first ads were shown, eventually the engagement rates kept coming down. And as a result, we started making bigger and louder creatives, flash creatives that that were intended to bring back the engagement rates high up where they were. Uh, the question is, did that help? Uh, I think to an extent it did. The engagement rates came up to an extent, but that also resulted in creation of this whole group of users, 200 million users to be uh, more than 200 million users to be precise, that we cater to, which we call as ad aware users, and that is what they really are. These are uh, VIP users as we see them, and you can reach these users. And you also asked like what are the key characteristics of these users, right? So let me like there are like few things that clearly distinguish these users from standard users. And the first and the foremost uh, point is these users have control of their browsing experience. So what that means is if they wish, they can easily turn off all ads completely uh, by clicking a button. It is as simple as that. But these users understand that, like I mentioned earlier, that for the web to be free, there have to be ads. But more importantly, the question would be, yes, that is good for the publishers. They would make money out of that. But as a brand or as an advertiser, does that matter to me? And the second part is these not just do these users understand the web function, but uh, they are also more likely to discover brands online. They spend a lot more online. Research has shown that these users are less price conscious. I mean, I can go on and on. Another example is these users uh, are more likely to talk about a product and a service. If they buy something and if they like the product or service, they are more likely to talk about it on social media channels. And in fact, they can be your brand ambassadors. They can help you create a better awareness about your products. So yeah, there is this whole yeah, this is what these two things combined together, I would say, are the main characteristics of ad aware users.
And I hear you saying something about a two-way street, a relationship in which there's give and there's take. And to some extent, you begin to think about some of the ways that influencers work and brand ambassadors, as you call out. So within those characteristics, I hear you saying that not only are these ad-aware people self-selecting for certain kinds of experiences, they're carrying those forward and bringing value to the ecosystem in which they work. So if I'm a brand, if I'm an advertiser and I'm gunning for that kind of relationship with a consumer, what happens if I successfully achieve access to those ad-aware cohorts? What have you seen rather start to happen for the partners or the brands that you've been watching and coaching through these experiences?
I would like to say magic, but I mean, yeah, it is in a way. Let me list down what happens, and then you can decide it for yourself, right? So first, when you reach these users, you're respecting their preferences. So you are going to show them kind of ad formats in the environment that they like, in the environment that they have chosen. So which means by respecting their choices, you are more likely to build a better brand image. Secondly, these users see fewer ads on a page as opposed to a standard consumer who sees maybe 7 ads, 8 ads on a page. These users are exposed to maybe 2 or 3 ads on a page, which means the likelihood of your brand getting noticed is much higher if you reach these users. Uh, Currently, there hasn't been an easy way to reach these users because of the softwares that they use. What that means for you as a brand or a marketer is the inventory is currently highly underpriced. It's a short-term thing, but that can be taken advantage of at the moment. Eventually, considering the characteristics of these users, maybe this inventory is going to be more expensive than standard users. But at the moment, there is this little gap where the inventory is highly underpriced. What else?
I
Uh,
mean,
Sorry, just a couple of finishing thoughts. So in order to reach these users, you would cut through the ad tech clutter. which means you would save a lot on ad tech taxes, and you can have a closer relationship with these users. And yeah, I mean, buying viewable inventory has become a norm, right? Everyone buys viewable inventory. But what I would really like to see is us going beyond buying just viewable inventory, but also trying to buy ad aware inventory.
I hear a couple of threads there. I hear to a certain extent that within this cohort, these ad aware eyeballs and ears, less is more and accounts for more. I also hear you describing a space for vanguards, for people who are going to get out, brands and advertisers who can get out early and start to claim some of this territory and take advantage of the fact that it's not highly competitive or as highly competitive as you envision that it will become. So, okay, if I'm on board, we'll make this our concluding thought, as I know that time is fleeting here, but it's been wonderful to have you. Thank you. If I'm a brand and advertiser, I'm on board with this. I want a piece of this territory. What are some of the best ways right now that we can target these ad aware audiences?
Cool. Yeah. Firstly, thanks. It has been nice chatting with you, James. And yeah, in interest of time, I'll keep it short. But historically, it hasn't been easy to reach these users at scale, and that is the problem that we are solving. You can reach these users through programmatic pipes quite easily. You don't need to change the way you work too much. And also the plus is you can reach these users on the publisher websites that you trust. Uh, it's not complicated. It's through programmatic pipes. What I would say is anyone who is interested in finding out more about how you can reach these users or just have any questions, reach out to me. My email address is a.mylastname@io.com, or just hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to talk about this.
Aditya, what a pleasure. And you come back and tell us some more about how this is developing as the ad aware space matures and becomes as robust as you envision it. I think it'll be an interesting time to check in again and see what it looks like in 2021. You are watching the Digiday Media Buyers Summit, and that was Aditya Padai, who's the Director of Business Development at IO. I'm James O'Brien, the Head of Production here at Digiday, and we'd like to hand the reins back over now to Cristina Munoz.
Thank you so much, James. I really appreciate that and appreciate the session with both of you. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about the insanity of social media right now. I would love to bring up Renly Morel. She's the social activation director at Essence, where we're going to discuss, yeah, in a time where there's the Facebook boycott and TikTok insanity, just everything that's happening on social media. So Renly, Renelli, I would love to bring you
That's
up.
right. Hi. Hello.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I literally just Googled and watched a YouTube video of you saying your name, and then I got it wrong. So sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. Like, all
right.
Good. You kind of like correcting it, but hi, happy to be here, Christina. And I loved your little intro about the interesting world of social media in 2020.
Well, before we really dive into the pure insanity, do you maybe want to do like just a table set of okay, I said a bit in the intro, but maybe just from your perspective, what is the social media landscape like right now, and how are buyers managing it?
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows that 2020 has been quite the year. And it's been a huge year for social media. Globally, as everyone is working from home or being more frequently home, that's really changed the perspective and really propelled people to be online more, and that also means social media is a big part of that. So I would say when we've been reviewing all of the earnings, like quarterly earnings report, new fronts that happened a few months ago, you can see that all of the major social platforms reported some pretty steep increases in usage and engagement. So it makes sense why that happened, as it's going hand in hand with the global event that's going on right now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I think we're gonna have to start this session by talking about TikTok. You know, Oracle is potentially going to be this technology partner for TikTok should the Trump administration approve that deal, but that doesn't really seem to satisfy the executive order. So much of what I've heard from media buyers so far has been like, I don't know what's gonna happen. You know, what's your take? Like, are you also a shrug?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think right now, just as you said, all we can do is wait to see what happens, because just when you think you know the direction that it's going to go, you know, something new comes up. But I feel like, you know, there's definitely been a ton of uncertainty with TikTok, and I feel for the folks who are working there, some of which that I, contact in day to day. So, this deal does, as you said, seem quite different to what we initially thought would be happening, you know, with, at the time it was Microsoft and potentially Walmart or others. But I think it's still hard to tell like what the implication of Oracle's involvement as a trusted data partner, what does that actually mean? But I think should it, you know, tick the boxes that the administration wants, I think that that would see an increase in, you know, what media buyers are doing on the platform. You know, all of this news, surprisingly, and maybe it's just like a Gen Z thing, hasn't really swayed some of the usage on the platform. There's still, you know, really some strong usage there, about like 100 million users in the US. Globally, they're at 800 million users. And there's continued engagement that they're seeing. So while all of this is happening, there is strength in that platform. So, but should it go in the other direction where, you know, and the deadline's coming up because I believe it's September 20th, then I think there will be some wariness by media buyers in terms of, you know, reconsidering how they approach that platform. So your guess is as best as mine. I think we're all really, you know, I'm rooting for them. It's always exciting when we have a new platform come into play. So we'll kind of keep close on that.
Yeah, it's such a strange moment because, you know, everyone had expected it to be Microsoft, and then it's like Oracle. What?
It's like the one that no one saw coming. So
yeah.
Interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder, you know, we've been in this sort of limbo with TikTok for some time where it's just like, okay, like what's going to happen? We don't know what's going to happen. And then you have this potential deal that doesn't seem like it would take it out of limbo, but there is this deadline. So it's a very strange time for TikTok overall. All right, so, you know, maybe let's back up a little bit from the TikTok of it all and just sort of talk about, you know, the social landscape as it has been. Every time I talk to marketers, it's like, okay, you know, are you going to diversify your dollars a bit more? Are you going to get off of this reliance on Facebook and Instagram? And then what you hear from them is like, oh, well, we would love to get, you know, to diversify a little bit more, but, you know, the performance is there. Facebook and Instagram is really where it's at.
Yeah.
Even though Instagram is for the olds, the like millennials. The old millennials who are like the olds at this
like me, old millennial.
I mean, same. But yeah, what are you hearing from buyers? Is it still this focus on Facebook and Instagram when it comes to the social platforms?
Yeah, I think when you think about the social landscape, as you said, it's kind of undeniable based on the numbers and the usage that Facebook and Instagram, they are massive, right? They have such a global footprint. They have a huge footprint in the US. So as you mentioned, like they, you know, there is that sort of like, because they've been around for so long and have that breadth and depth and the sophistication of their ad platform, you know, there's a lot of benefits that people and buyers have seen to running on those places. But I think with that said, with everything going on, I think now more than ever, buyers are very conscious about you know, where they spend their money. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So in some instances, you know, this has been the year based on everything that's going on where initially the first instance would be like, yeah, it would make sense to test into something or try this out on Facebook and Instagram. But I think now buyers are considering other platforms, you know, and this is an opportunity where, you know, we know what works well on these larger platforms because we've been activating on them for so long, but really considering some of the other players out there for maybe a test or a first to market opportunity. So I think it's a moment that we're having where buyers are really thinking through what are those other options and maybe diversifying a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. You know, when we spoke previously, you mentioned that with TikTok, we're seeing this evolution of a platform at an accelerated scale. Could you expand on that and also say what impact that's had on the way that marketers and media buyers are looking at TikTok?
Yep. Yeah, I think it's funny. I feel like most people are very aware of how quickly TikTok just kind of exploded onto the media.
Just like that.
Just like that. I mean, let me take you back to 2017, where, you know, that's when ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, acquired and merged with Musical.ly. If you were ever on the Musical.ly platform, I forced myself on there just to see how it was. But that was sort of the beginning of this like growth that happened on the platform where we saw that it was happening globally. And then eventually it came here to the US. And then we started seeing questions within the industry is like, is this a fad? Will it last? Will it be one of those things that just appeared and went away? And I think it's clear based on the numbers, the engagement, and really some of the testing that we've seen some larger brands do on the platform that it has staying power. So I think that's really in a short amount of time, a lot of change, a lot of growth, and a lot of evolution. And they've also have done a good job of staffing up some of their operations in the US, you know, based on what we've seen. So TikTok's done a lot of work, and I think they're really doing their best to showcase that they are quite important in this industry.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely more than like 13-year-olds dancing in a way that isn't embarrassing. Truly strange. But TikTok, obviously, like they're not the only social platform. You know, we were just talking about Facebook and Instagram, but Facebook and Instagram, as you kind of hinted at before, they've had these issues with the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. You know, Facebook's been under this microscope. It honestly didn't seem like the Stop Hate for Profit campaign had much of a long-term effect. It was like there was this focus on it for 2 weeks and then kind of dissipated a bit. But, you know, I'm wondering what impact that had on the perception of Facebook and Instagram for marketers and media buyers overall. Like, was there any lasting effect there?
Yeah, I think overall, like, I think the intent of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign has been, in general, helping to combat things across the internet when it comes to hate speech and harassment. So the focal point has been on Facebook because they're so large, right? But I think the impact, like to your point, I guess like outwardly speaking, it's hard to see sort of what the impact, but I will say that there's been some really healthy conversation happening with partners in terms of, you know, what should we be seeing, what should we be doing, and how should we be showing up? Where historically, you know, it's our job to really key in and focus on performance, right? We want to make sure that we're delivering the right message in front of the right audience, and really delivering on what we promised to our, you know, our plans, our clients, et cetera. But now the focus has changed. It's like ROI is important, delivering the right message is important, but also showing up in the right places that we kind of have the same values that our consumers do is important too. So it's really just like, the impact that it's had, to answer your question, is like an evolution of how do we think about media planning online? How do we think about it responsibly? And how do we partner with vendors, all vendors, to really deliver on that? So it's really accelerated, because some of this conversation has been happening historically, but 2020 has just really accelerated it to another level. So I think it's a good thing at the end of the day that we're having these dialogues and conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like there has been that conversation, and you hear from media buyers that, like, okay, Facebook has been, more open to these conversations, which makes sense. You have buyers who are behind huge budgets who are saying, we're not going to spend with you for this month or maybe even 6 months. Obviously that makes sense, but much of Facebook's revenue comes from small businesses, and small businesses can't really afford, especially right now, to stay off the platform. So I guess I just wonder, like, how much control there really is, or how much those conversations will go beyond conversations. Because it's one thing for Facebook to sort of say, oh, okay, we hear you, we're listening, we're going to make these changes, but also, like, we're big, we need us, we know that you need us for your performance. So, like, once you, like, get over it a little bit, you'll feel like we had a convo and we're good. So I don't know. Like, what do you think? Will it go beyond conversation is what I mean.
I see some healthy dialogue happening. I think, it's undeniable that Facebook is pretty massive, right? So they just have that level of scale. But I think that there is an understanding that they don't want to sort of not be good partners. I think, even though that's, like, partnership is still a big part of working through, right? So I think, like you said, that we're seeing some change more than we have ever before, and that's a good thing. So I think the continued dialogue is going to help us get there. And also, like, I know we talked about TikTok before, but should things shake out with how the administration feels, like, they are looking to do more with small to medium-sized businesses. So recently they've been advertising a lot of benefits to smaller businesses. If they advertise on their platform, that they can get some credit. So there's a lot happening. I think that in 2020, once you think that you know how it's going to play out, something changes. So just got to wait and see.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting that, TikTok has picked up on the power of small business and trying to target those small businesses to help grow its advertising business. It's probably a story we should do about how TikTok is recognizing that. I do wonder if they'll be able to woo any small businesses, away from Facebook. I guess TBD.
TBD.
Okay, we were talking about the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. I mentioned this at the beginning, but, Stop Hate for Profit kind of had died down. And then yesterday, a bunch of celebrities were like, you know what? I'm going to sit out Facebook and Instagram for a day. I'm going to sit it out. And they're participating in this one-day boycott of the platform. They say to stop the spread of hate speech. Do you think that's going to reignite a focus on Facebook and hate speech? Or is it something where it's like, oh, the celebs are doing something again?
Well, I think, again, I think we'll have to kind of wait and see how things play out. This is sort of one thing that we've learned about 2020 as well, is that usually when we have things pop up and pop in, there's just been a constant thread of conversation happening. I think, if we are creating milestones and we are continuing to push things and continuing to try and make a better sense for advertising, I think everyone benefits from that. So I can foresee, people getting continually involved, especially in the state of the world. So just gotta wait and see. But I think collectively as an industry, we are ready for change. We are ready for what may come because of all the contingency planning that we've had to do. So I'm sure there are a lot of people on this call who understand exactly what I mean, just with all the changes that have happened. But
for sure. Do you think there's going to be, more of a focus on just hate speech and what that's like on platforms and sort of managing that as we get closer to the election? I mean, we're less than 50 days away. There's a lot that happens on social social networks. And do you think buyers are going to want to pull out for a bit just to avoid being next to that content?
Yeah, I think it's all dependent on what the buyer's priorities are. But I will say that all buyers are thinking about it. It's on everyone's radar. And I think they're asking the questions as to like, where does it make sense to show up? You know, they're analyzing placements, looking at ad units, tracking conversations. So it's like having those pipelines of measurement and understanding and analysis in place to really figure out how do we be agile. So preparation is key. And that is what buyers are really focused on. I think we know what the value is of social media. It's important, but we have a responsibility, not just for what we do, but for our clients and for our users to really pay attention to what's happening within the industry and be agile and flexible. So I would say that that's really been the biggest impact for this year. But whatever happens, we are ready for it.
For sure. If you guys have any questions for Anelli, just pop them down below, and I'll try and get to that before we're done, which is like 3 minutes from now. But just pop a queue if you have one, and I'll ask it. I guess I would love a little bit more clarity of like, okay, we've talked about like turning on a dime, like having to have these contingency plans in place. Like, what does that actually look like? Also, you know, are we going to see, say TikTok like does get banned, it's out. Are we going to see all of this like creative that was intended for TikTok just show up on Instagram now? Is that how it's going to be? Like what? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very fair question. I think like Christina, if you and I were working on a contingency plan together, we would look at what audiences do we feel can be replicated on other channels. It would be one thing that we would consider. What sort of objective types or KPIs that we can activate on other channels. But to your point, ad units are important. So we know that there's a lot of landscape and portrait mode assets. Some can be repurposed, but I think it is still important to look at how can we tweak creative so that it's still optimized for those channels. So I think it's really looking at things holistically in terms of KPIs, audience, messaging, creative. How do we tweak things so that we're being a little bit more agile? So I think that's sort of the lens that buyers are looking at for this level of agility, if that makes sense.
It does. It's just interesting if you like scroll through Reels, which is Reels even really worth talking about? Like our buyers super interested in Reels. I don't know, everything that I see on Reels is someone's taken a TikTok and they've just posted it on Reels.
Well, the interesting thing is too, is that before Reels kind of was released, that was happening a bit on Instagram stories where you would see a lot of that, which is a smart move from TikTok to watermark all of their assets so that once they are shared, you can kind of see where the original source is. But I think Reels is going to be an interesting one. It's so early that it's hard to tell what the adoption is, but the fact that it's baked into a massive audience that already exists on Instagram is interesting. And I think the last thing that I'll say about that, because we had some internal conversations about it, is, you know, this reminds us at the time when, you know, Snapchat came out and then, you know, Stories was new. And Stories is quite massive. So I think there's definitely potential based on that historical view of just that there's potential with Reels. We just have to wait and see.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of wait and see.
So much wait and see.
So much wait and see.
I guess the last question for you would be the Snapchat of it all, because one thing that has come up with buyers in conversations has just been like, oh yeah, we're all looking at Snapchat again. We keep looking at Snapchat again. Why is the shift to Snapchat?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I feel like Snapchat's an interesting one where they have been focused a lot on their original content. They have been really pushing the limit in terms of their lens technology. And I think they've just done a really good job of making their developer tools easier to use. Whereas it's like less of a heavy lift, if you know what I mean. So because of that ease, because of their advancements in terms of their self-service platform tools, I think it just makes it a bit more viable for people to test into. And they do have a pretty large audience as well. I think they're around, within the US, 80 million monthly users. I have to double check that number, but that's why I feel that people are giving Snapchat that second look in terms of the technology, the audience base, some of the interesting things that they're doing with their Snap original contents. So yeah, I mean, and personally, I think it's fun. You know, there's that shared experience with lenses too that you're able to do with your families, which is always a fun thing to do.
For sure. Thank you so much, Renelli. Apologies we can't get to your audience question, but maybe Renelli could DM you. I don't know.
Okay.
TBD.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time. Okay, so next up, we're going to hear from Ariel Garcia. She's the Chief Privacy Officer at Worldwide. She's going to talk about how privacy is everything, which it definitely is. If we could bring up Ariel to the stage. Thanks so much, Ariel.
Hello, thank you. Great to be here. So my name is Ariel Garcia. I am Chief Privacy Officer for and I'll be taking you through a presentation on why privacy is everything and a bit of a check-in on privacy since GDPR and CCPA came into effect, and really what it means for brands and for agencies in terms of our day-to-day. So I will share my screen. I apologize, I'm struggling to share my screen. Here we go.
Should work momentarily, don't worry. Zoom can be a tricky partner.
Here
there we go.
All right, perfect. All right. So jumping right in, we're going to talk about a few things, a bit of an overview and a check-in. We're going to talk about some of the changes in the regulatory landscape, how the industry is evolving in response, and what you can all do. So I always like to say that privacy at its core is a business imperative. I think traditionally there's been a tendency to think about privacy from more of the legal perspective. And so as privacy becomes a day-to-day topic in our industry, really want to solidify what that means to us. And it starts with people. So ultimately, our audience is who we're trying to reach. People want personalization, but they also do care about how their data is used and collected and shared. And so the laws that are emerging are really there to protect them and to codify those expectations. And so for brands, brands that really embed that privacy into how they work are best positioned to build that trust. And you know, that trust is becoming incredibly important. I know a lot of us are keeping up with all of the news on the solutions emerging for third-party cookie deprecation as an example. And we all know that first and second-party data is going to become increasingly important. So studies have shown that consumers are more willing to share their data with brands that they trust. And so that trust and brand loyalty is incredibly important to really data strategy. And so with that said, you know, public sentiment is evolving, certainly, but at its core, it really remains consistent. And what people care about is really that transparency, accountability, and choice. They don't want their data to be shared with third parties if they've asked for it not to be. They want control in order to express their preferences, and they want transparency on how their data is being used. And so as laws start to emerge aligning to those cultural norms, what we see is a patchwork regulatory and legal framework. And the reason for that is, while at their core, people want transparency, accountability, and choice, there are differences across countries in terms of what the legislative and regulatory priorities are. And so what we'll see is in certain countries, laws are emerging that are more focused on principles of data localization and how to balance those data localization imperatives that are really economy driven, or in some cases national security driven, against the desire to be players in the global economy. In other countries, so for example in Europe, where privacy is embedded as a fundamental right, you really see that attitude towards law and regulation that's more rights-based and about protecting people from a rights perspective. And so what we end up with is really a set of laws and regs that vary pretty significantly across the board. So if we take a look at the landscape today, GDPR and CCPA are kind of the most stringent laws that have been enacted to date. And even within those two, there are key differences. So if you think about GDPR was basically an opt-in regime. There are other lawful bases that you can have for using data, but CCPA is completely different. CCPA is really focused on that notion of giving people the ability to opt out of sale, which is unique to CCPA. And CCPA, which just came into effect in January and recently started being enforced, there's already a ballot initiative, and it's going on the November ballot to amend it pretty significantly. It would bring it more in line with GDPR, though as you can see, even there will be differences. And ultimately, CCPA, CPRA, that's just the beginning within the US. So there are a slew of other states that are actively working to enact or have enacted their own laws. So in terms of what's passed, it's been Maine and Nevada, though those are more limited in scope, which is why CCPA continues to be most top of mind. And the reality is all of that state patchwork that's emerging really makes compliance impractical or difficult or expensive for brands and companies to operationalize. And so what you'll see is this strengthening push for federal legislation, especially with CPRA on the horizon, as that would become the de facto most stringent law. And so internationally, the same thing is happening. So recently, the LGPD, Thailand's PDPA, and there are several others that are in development. And while I think COVID-19 had slowed down some of that policy work, largely it's forging ahead. And if anything, if we think about the current context that we're in right now, the realities of COVID-19 have actually amplified some of those concerns or dialogue around the use of data, like for example, biometric data, children's data, since they're connected from home, in virtual learning environments, etc. And so while you have this patchwork of laws that's emerging across the globe and even domestically, we live in the reality where the digital ecosystem is borderless. And a lot of that in our space is driven by these global platforms and increasingly, these efforts to scale your ability to activate across markets. And at its core, our industry is addressing this as a whole. And so when something happens in one market, there are parallel discussions and dialogues that start in other markets. And so what we have here is some of the key topics to watch from specifically for our industry. And the first and largest, and probably the one that we will all be talking about the most in the coming months and potentially year, is third-party cookies, tracking, and identity. So we all know about recent changes that browsers have made or announcements that they have made about changes to your ability to use third-party cookies. So third-party cookie deprecation at its core, similar to Apple's iOS 14 changes, raises that question of, okay, so without these identifiers that we were previously able to use, what is the privacy safe way to enable audience activation and measurement at scale? And from a children's data perspective, I mentioned before that a lot of COVID-19's impact on that was because children are now in virtual learning environments more often. Obviously, for a while there, screen time increased. And so there is this heightened scrutiny on tech companies' use of children's data and as a spillover effect, how children's data is used or collected from a marketing perspective as well. Mobile location data is another one. So recently Congress sent a letter to the FTC asking for a probe of the mobile ad industry's tracking of consumers. And this is another one that is very interesting to think about in the current social climate and COVID-19 context, because, you know, obviously with contact tracing, that mobile location data was interesting because in some ways it could actually, it became clear that data when used for public good can really even help get our economy back on track. And yet at the same time, you have this potential for misuse of that data in ways that not only might not be welcomed by individuals, but also could actually have a chilling effect on their willingness to protest, for example. And so you'll continue to see that that's going to be a very hot topic in this space. From a biometric data perspective, again, in today's context, that's especially important. There's a ton going on around facial recognition and standards for use, or in some cases, entire, you know, bans. And then algorithmic bias is another one that has come about, particularly in today's social context. Facebook had recently announced that they are studying the racial bias that might be embedded in some algorithms to make sure that it isn't. And that concept of just ethical artificial intelligence and ethical algorithms will continue to be an increasing focus. Beyond that, from like a practical day-to-day perspective and what we're dealing with right now, you know, CCPA continues to cause some confusion. There are still elements of it that are not where the ambiguity hasn't entirely been removed. And on that same point, there are elements of it that, you know, the industry companies are still working to best operationalize and streamline. And then second, cross-border data transfer. So Schrems 2 was a decision in Europe that basically resulted in a preliminary order that was sent to Facebook saying that they can't transfer information about European residents to the US. And so ultimately what's happening there is it requires more of a political solution. If you're familiar with that issue at its core, it's really about Europe saying, like, de facto, perhaps US's privacy laws are not protective enough of people's information from government surveillance. And so we're continuing to watch that space, but in the interim, you have companies trying to interpret how to you know, comply with that, and how to restructure if needed, or what to do to be able to still engage in that cross-border data transfer, which is so important in today's digital economy. And so the answer to this is really going to require collaboration. Collaboration across industry groups, collaboration between brands and their agencies, as well as ad tech companies and publishers. And all of us ultimately are here to serve people. And from a collaboration perspective, we think about this in three ways. So from a policy standpoint, there are several initiatives that are advocating for federal legislation to try to streamline that patchwork and align on standards that are consistent and workable given the nature of the digital ecosystem. Then from a standards perspective, it's really about going beyond that concept of compliance and all of this patchwork framework of different, you know, requirements to look at what's actually good for people. Is getting a constant cookie banner really the intent of what GDPR was trying to achieve? Probably not. So what are the actual standards that we should be adhering to when using location data? You know, so that's something that the MMA is working on. So and recently, I know in Europe, from the government's perspective, they've been working on codes of practice for use of children's data. So this is something that will require collaboration and dialogue between the industry and regulators with consumers at the heart. And then finally, frameworks. You know, a lot of this sounds like it's academic, but there are things that we actually need to put into practice. And so what I'm going to go through on this next slide is something that we've been talking a lot about, both within our agency and also with clients, around how to operationalize some of CCPA's requirements. So the industry has developed a couple of tools to help facilitate those requirements. They're fundamentally different. They require support from agency ad operations teams, from client website teams. Similarly, platforms have also released similar tools, and what these tools are all aiming to do is basically allow brands to say, hey, if you have my pixel on your site, you only want me to use that information that you send to me to provide services to you. So what we've had to do, because some of this is not in our day-to-day media planning discussions, is kind of level set and say, hey, you may have heard about Facebook's recent announcement about limited data use. How would you like us to handle that for your brand? We want to make sure that we're aligning to your approach. And so to that end, it also involves thinking through and helping integrate across that stack. So if you're using the IAB solution and passing a signal and the client already has a consent management platform or preference management tool, how do those two things talk to each other? How does that talk to Google and restricted data processing? How does that talk to Facebook? And so you see that even in terms of operationalizing this, it really requires collaboration, not only across partners, advertisers and agencies, but also across the industry, because that concept of interoperability is becoming so fundamentally important. And so at the core of all of this, to future-proof your brand, it's really important to understand that trust is currency today. And the key to all of this is really using data responsibly. And when we say responsibility, what we're talking about is uses of data that are ethical and fair from the consumer's perspective. And so this is what you can do in terms of how to embed that into your day-to-day. And that first item is as I mentioned before, engaging in that dialogue. Have those discussions with your brands, with your partners, on how they're approaching privacy, how their organization's thinking about it, how they want to approach specifically, with CCPA, what tools, systems they have in place. Really, bring this from being just a topic that lives in a silo to something that's part of your media strategy, because it's going to matter. If the example I like to use is, if you're a brand, some brands, what they've done is they've set up a consent management platform, and basically they've tried to apply GDPR-like standards around the world. So what that means is, let's say that they think that consent is required for cookies. When you visit their site, you need to opt in before there's going to be a cookie dropped. If the agency doesn't know that they've taken that broad approach and that's going to impact data outside of Europe, then you're going to see your data availability drop. Now, if you knew that was how they were set up, it might change the recommendations that you'd make from a media perspective. And so that dialogue is really becoming critical to connecting the dots and making sure that we're making the best use of marketing investment. And so what do you do after you have an understanding of that? It's really asking the right questions. And so on the right side here, I talked through what those are. We think about this from three perspectives. First is, if you're sourcing data, where's that data coming from? So the provenance of the data, how often is it being refreshed? Where did it come from? How is it collected, etc. Then there's the activation piece of it. Who's getting that data? So like in the Pixel example, who's that data being passed to? What are they doing with it? Are they only using it for that brand? Are they using it to benefit other brands, to refine their algorithms? How are they being transparent with what those uses are? And from a brand's perspective, are they comfortable with those uses? And then ultimately, data use in context. So it's not enough to just vet the data itself and the partners. It's important to really understand the use cases and think about them from the consumer's perspective in terms of whether it's a use that they would find to be fair or expected. again, as that first party data becomes more important or increasingly important, those one-to-one consumer relationships become incredibly important. And as does this concept of creating a fair value exchange with consumers. They need to feel like they've gotten something in exchange for that data. And then finally, in terms of that patchwork and reconciling it, it's really about thinking through solutions that can help you scale and streamline. So, you know, we talked about the fragmented solutions, even with CCPA, that's compounded when you think about it on a global scale. So thinking through interoperable solutions, whether it's for CCPA compliance or whether it's from a, you know, preference management standpoint, or whether it's dealing with third-party cookie deprecation and that impact to your media strategy. It's just incredibly important to think through holistically your solutions and how these approaches to privacy impact the work that we do for clients, and ultimately, you know, the value that consumers receive.
Thank you so much, Ariel. So appreciate that. I don't actually think we have time for questions today. We've kind of run out of time. But I, you know, so appreciate your presentation. And, you know, if anyone has questions, I'm sure they can reach out to you. I would love to be back to last October, where I was at the ANAs just like running around talking to people about CCPA. That was way more fun than the coronavirus.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so obviously today we've wrapped up. That was our last session with Ariel. If you have questions for her, you should totally try and reach out to her. So I just want to remind you guys that we'll be back tomorrow, 11 a.m. It's, you know, a session, I'm losing my words here. A bunch of sessions that my coworker Seb Joseph will moderate. And you know, you can take a look on our site to see who you will hear from then. I just want to lastly say that if you got an invite for a Facebook event after this, pop over to that Zoom when we finish up here. Okay, so thank you guys so much for your time. We'll see you tomorrow. Looking forward to it. Thanks for joining us for the Digiday Media Buyer Summit Day 1.